sermon title today, the trajectory of planet Nibiru. I wonder if anybody else have heard about that planet or Googled it to see what it is. Is there anybody that have heard it before? Okay. So that conspiracy is more prevalent than I thought. I didn't know about it until a relative of mine that works in Kazakhstan these days sent me an email 2 weeks ago and said, I want to talk to you about Nibiru. Out of the blue, he hasn't had contact with me for about 2 years, and suddenly here's Nibiru, and I didn't have any idea what it was about. So I had to Google it and found this interesting collection of nonsense, to treat it kindly. But let me not get too excited about that. I would prefer today and these days to rather be silent, because there is so much that weighs on one's very being with things happening in the world, and also what happened yesterday in Charlottesville. As examples and probably exponents of a general condition of unease, instability, and things that can really be distressing. What to make of it all, I sometimes don't know. And what I will share with you today, I do not regard as great wisdom. I do not regard it as solutions. And as I say, it is a few thoughts offered around that sermon title against the backdrop of that passage that Rich read, that we can perhaps ponder and see it perhaps as just the introduction to a conversation. The planet Nibiru is the invention of one David Mead, that is the author of a book, 2017 Arrival, Planet X. That's what he called his book. And this Planet X is also called Nibiru. And it is a planet that is supposedly going to crash into our planet with resulting destruction in 2017. The original date set by this gentleman was was in October, but now it has been moved up to September the 23rd. So it's imminent, going to happen soon. And this is the rehashing of a conspiracy that was first emerged in this form in a book of one John Sitchin, 1976. He published his book, and it is about this planet and about aliens mining gold in Africa called the Anunnaki. I don't know if you've encountered that term somewhere, but they were mining gold, and in the process they were also playing around with genetics and created humanity in the process when these ancient aliens that were mining Africa's gold were around. And this was picked up again and dusted off and presented again by this David Mead. So this Planet X will crash into us now. The date's been moved up, as I say, to September the 23rd. This is probably it was done, this moving up of the date, to work in the great American eclipse of the sun that is also due August 21st, I think. Impressive, and I wish we were living in an area where one could really observe this and experience a full eclipse, but I think we will have something of it. I'm not sure how much we can see. This David Meade arrives at his lunacy with working with the number 33. That's the number he picked. And he plays around with geography and with geometry and with astronomy. And in the end, and he arrives through that, the number 33, at this date and this planet X that will destroy us. Naturally, he uses the Bible as well, because that fits very well with conspiracy theories, especially the book of Revelation, which he works in. But he starts off with the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 13, verses 9 and 10, and then he jumps back to, or forward to the book of Revelation, chapter 13, that he also works in, and constructs this thing, the planet, and he says this is what the Bible says. That is not the first time people do that. It is very customary to use that kind of literature. What is perhaps surprising is that we find that kind of literature also in the Gospels. It's not often read, and with people who profess that the gospel is a gospel of love, that part is sort of, ignored. You don't read it that often, and it's uncomfortable to deal with it. This huge judgment that is coming, and Jesus speaking in the themes and in the language of apocalyptic literature, literature that deals with the final destruction of earth. We find that kind of literature, as I said, can't remember if it's last week or 2 weeks ago, it emerged, this kind of literature, apocalyptic literature, in Jewish and Christian circles. In the few centuries before and after the birth of Jesus, when things were really bad. Terrible conditions, terrible persecutions, and the Jewish people and all the factions in them, the different communities there, like the Essenes, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and every political grouping cultural grouping that you can identify in the broader Jewish community, and also the Christian community, each with their own version. And some exponents of those communities embraced and created apocalyptic literature, which deals with the end of times. And it is a literature and a theology and a way of thinking of desperation and hopelessness, saying there is no hope for us on this plane. The only hope for us is for God to intervene and to clear the table, destroy God's enemies, which is also our enemies, and then God's people will be rewarded to be with God in the New Jerusalem forever. And the people that were destroyed by God, that were killed off, and their armies and all evil will burn forever in the pit of fire. That's more or less the story, but it is born out of hopelessness, out of desperation. And it is a hope also of destruction, of devastation. So it is a bit strange to find Jesus also speaking in those terms in the Gospel according to Mark. And Mark is not the only Gospel that contains these passages. We find it scattered throughout the passages and also in other books of the Bible, predominantly in the book of Daniel, then Revelation, also in Isaiah, some in Ezekiel. and so forth. And also in the letters of Paul, we encountered this apocalyptic thinking. It is impossible for me in the span or the scope of one little sermon to give you an indication of the characteristics of the apocalyptic literature. But I think it is very important for us, in these days especially, to be aware of what kinds of literature we find in our Bible, what meaning to assign it to it, and how to approach it. What it is and what it is not is of critical importance. And why do I say that? In these days where final solutions are again contemplated, in a new nuclear age, the Bible is also part of the conversation. Because in this narrative and the situation with North Korea, a Southern Baptist minister with a mega church weighed in, Dr. Jeffries. And he grabbed and dusted off Romans chapter 13 again, grabbed it by the scruff of its neck and brought that chapter firmly into the conversation and said, the United States, and by all means the president of this nation, and let me make it clear, I'm not talking about Donald Trump and criticizing him. I'm talking about the institution, the office of president. But Jeffrey said, the United States is justified in launching a preemptive strike and to destroy North Korea. God says that is fine. Because God gave the United States that authority. Because all authority, he says, was instituted by God. Now, the logic in that reasoning escapes me. We are, per definition, for his reasoning, the good guys given authority. And the other guys were given then something else, because they have also authority. How can we destroy them as God's responsibility assigned to us? That is an example of the devastation that can be implemented and executed when we work with the Bible in an irresponsible way. When we look at the apocalyptic literature, I think the first thing we should know, apart from it being a theology and a literature of desperation and of hopelessness and of total destruction and annihilation, the important thing is to realize that it is not prophetic literature in the sense that people understand prophetic literature, that it has to do with the future. Apocalyptic literature deals with the past and with the present of the time in which it was written. It is not predicting the future of anything. Now, I think it is therefore responsible, especially in this age, where I sometimes despair when I observe and experience what feels to me like a dark cloud of ignorance descending on us, where there is an active war against science and scientific research, and where ignorance becomes a virtue. It scares me to death, more so than any apocalyptic literature piece, that we are entertaining conditions like that, where we wage war on science and the scientific enterprise. It feels to me as if that is part of the total annihilation of the concept of truth. And it feels to me as if we need to pause, and especially as Christians, Ask ourselves again, what is our duty, especially our moral duty, in the time that we live in? If we look at science, good scientists and good scientific methodology understands that you practice your craft in humility. That you do not practice it with arrogance. Good scientific methodology removes arrogance from the picture. Good scientific methodology and scientists also understand that you stand on the shoulders of people that came before you to arrive at your insight, that it is a collective enterprise. It is a cooperative one where you're part of a web of relationships that enables you to arrive at new insights. I'm not saying science is able to provide us with a moral code. Not at all. But there are worthwhile characteristics of good scientific practice that we can incorporate in our living of every day and also in our approach of the Bible. In this time of, they say, absolute solutions and final actions of destruction, I think it behooves us to avoid bringing in a literature that applauds that, especially when we do not understand the nature of that literature and where we command God to be the destructor in chief and to do the destruction that we perhaps desire. I think it is our calling, more so than a responsibility, is our calling in these days, not to stay ignorant about the kinds of literature that we find in our sacred text, but to engage continuously in the study of that, so that we at least know what to bring in where and what to be cautious of, and so that we do not become complicit in a misunderstanding, through a misunderstanding of our scriptures, to wreaking havoc, to causing destruction. I think it is our duty to continue to seek and to love the truth. To seek the truth with a moral compass of what we find overwhelmingly in the message of Jesus. To make that our priority, to love God above else, and to express that in the way that we are in the world. We cannot succumb to the desperation and the hopelessness of apocalyptic literature. It is a time for us to pause and think. A time for us to continue to embrace true hope, to practice love, and to continue to seek justice, like a good scientist will do and like a good Christian will do, with humility, with a love for truth, and also accepting that all knowledge and all human understanding, all of those are provisional, that it is up for revision, that we need to continuously work at it, and especially as Christians, to have the courage and the integrity to discard of moral frameworks that no longer provide for the situation that we find ourselves in. That is not the easy path. It is much easier to take what somebody has thought up in a different time and say, right, I accept all of that uncritically, and I will apply it in a situation where it no longer is true. Let us be diligent. Let us be faithful as God's people. And let us in this community, in this covenant community, make it our sacred duty to embrace the truth, to practice hope, to seek justice together. Because if we do not do that, and if we continue to wander around like sleepwalkers sometime, and if we are especially not prepared to have the courage to talk to one another, to try and find that common ground which I am convinced that Christians can find. If we are not prepared to do that, we had an illustration yesterday of what the end result is. An ugliness that scares me. Something that I do not associate America with. Something that I do not want to see happen in a nation that claims to be a Christian nation. Brothers and sisters, this is no ordinary time. There is an urgency in view of the international situation to embrace one another as God's people and do God's work. Amen.